Hey, welcome back, everyone. Happy Monday. Interesting stories to go into. I want to talk a bit about what's happening, updates with the case against Trump. Well, you're asking which one. And if you're wondering which one I'm talking about, well, that's half the point. I'm talking about the weaponization of government and how it's being used in what appears to be just political attacks against an individual to try to stop him from running for president. Now, what's interesting is that Alvin Bragg, the district attorney in New York, who brought these charges against Trump by elevating misdemeanors to a felony and using not even saying the crime that would justify that, which probably violates the Constitution. But regardless, he was asked to testify before Congress, or at least they're looking into it. Alvin Bragg responded by trying to press charges against Jim Jordan with the House Judiciary Committee and trying to avoid having to testify. Normally, you would call that contempt of Congress, but in this case, it's Alvin Bragg using justice. So I think it's fair to say that Alvin Bragg is trying to weaponize the law against the House of Representatives to block investigations into how he's weaponizing the law. And if you can't enjoy the humor and that irony, I don't know what to say. It is wild stuff. We're going to go into this and explain what's happening with it. Also, Trump is using legal warfare of his own, and this does tie into how he tends to operate. Look, just being blunt, the left in this country tends to be the one that uses more underhanded means. They're the ones who, more so than not, tend to engage in cancel culture, tend to engage in personal attacks during arguments, tend to roll out like fake events and Saul Alinsky type tactics where you dress up like the KKK and go to a protest and act like you support someone. They use that's actually Saul Alinsky tactics written in his own book, Rules for Radicals. I should know, and I'm not just making that up. They tend to use those types of tactics, and conservatives, generally being Christians or more religious people, at least in the United States, tend to not do those things. And Trump kind of took the rule book and just threw it out his window, which they don't like him for because he tends to do the things that they do. And he tends to attack. He fights back. What he's doing right now is also, you could argue, weaponizing the law. And he is now suing Michael Cohen, the star witness in the case against him. It's going to be very interesting. We're going to go into this. And also, this is not just a U.S. thing. This is an international thing. The United Nations right now is looking to give themselves additional special powers under states of emergency, and the U.S. State Department is backing them in getting those additional powers. This is basically going to be the weaponization of emergencies, and we'll discuss that as well. That said, folks, those of you on Twitter, Rumble, Facebook, YouTube, come join us on Epoch TV. We will go there exclusively after about 25 minutes. It's our uncensored video platform. We can talk about all the things that Facebook and YouTube will ban us for if we talk about them on here. So we will jump over there exclusively after about 25 minutes. So be sure to join us there. That said, let's jump into the first story for the day. Let's talk about Alvin Bragg ironically weaponizing the law to prevent investigations into how he's weaponizing the law. Let me show you. I should note, normally this is what you would call contempt of Congress, and Democrats kind of changed the law. They changed the rules of the game when it came to January 6th, because when they made their commission to investigate January 6th, aside from the point where they didn't accept the delegates from the Republican side, and instead chose two individuals handpicked by the Democrats who they said were Republicans, but people could argue they were not. Technically, at least in practice. Instead, handpicked two people who had voted previously to impeach Trump, while that commission was running what was just generally a politicized investigation, altering evidence and presenting half-truths as if they were entire truths. Really just desecrating truth, in my opinion. You can watch my documentary, The Real Story, January 6th, if you want to see my whole take on that. But what came out that was interesting in that is, among many things, is the Democrats altered essentially some of the basic rules of the game when it comes to contempt of Congress. Normally, if you subpoena someone to appear before Congress, they're required to show up. And if they don't show up, you can technically charge them with a crime, contempt of Congress. That is actually rarely done. But Democrats found a way where they could go after public officials. They could go after former top-line Trump associates. And if those individuals choose not to show up to what they believe is a politicized hearing, which it was, they were they're still threatening to throw them in prison for it. Now, Alvin Bragg is in a similar position. And with the precedent Democrats have now established, where individuals who refuse subpoenas or even try to weaponize the law against them can be thrown in prison, well, Bragg's in that seat now, living in the legacy of those bad, frankly, I'd say abuses of powers introduced, ironically, by the Democrats. Let's discuss this, folks. Let me show you first off here. This is CNN. It says, Manhattan DA Bragg sues GOP House Judiciary Chairman to prevent interference in Trump case. Now, keep in mind, this is how CNN is framing it. They're arguing that an investigation into how Alvin Bragg is weaponizing the law, his double standards, his frankly just not enforcing the law in many cases, or his reducing felonies down to misdemeanors, is strange if you consider now that he's doing the opposite when it comes to Trump. He's elevating a misdemeanor to a felony, and it looks like it's politicized. Now, what do you do in normal situations like this? You have a DA, a district attorney at the state level, and that district attorney is, by virtue of what he's doing, not only altering precedent, not only probably violating the law in his own actions, but using the seat of power he has been given to take action against the main runner for president of the United States. And again, the head of the opposition to the standing president. Now, under normal circumstances like that, what do? Do you allow a DA to basically undermine the entire election system? Do you allow a DA to change the law as they will, even to the point where they're not even stating the law someone is violating while charging them, which notably he did in order to validate his elevating a misdemeanor to a felony. He didn't actually state the law Trump violated. Do you allow that to happen, or do you investigate? I would say personally in normal situations, in situations like this, I wouldn't say normal because I don't think we've ever seen it before, at least not in the United States. You have to investigate them because this could be interference in the American elections, the foundation of our elected, government system. Well, Alvin Bragg, to prevent the investigation into him, is using his hold on power as a weapon against the House Judiciary Committee, and in a personal attack, actually, as well. Now, given the situation, of course, you could argue the other side, which is what CNN is doing. And they're saying that, well, by investigating Alvin Bragg, the federal government is interfering at the state level. And you could argue that. And I would argue that if, frankly, the tables were turned and it was Democrats in the House of Representatives and a Republican judge, and of course the Democrats were trying to, get a judge to come and testify, or a DA in this case, I would imagine Republicans would also be very unhappy about it. And so, there's some credibility on both sides. But, of course, the nuances of it are what make it important. But this is CNN's take, and they're taking it from that side. Let me show you. They say Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg is suing House Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan over what the lawsuit filed Tuesday describes as a, quote, transparent campaign to intimidate and attack his office's case against former President Donald Trump. The suit injects more legal drama into Bragg's investigation of Trump, which has been dogged for weeks by accusations from Republicans, and the prosecutor's pursuit of the former president was purely political, with claims being central to Jordan's own probe. I would argue that CNN itself even noted in its own reporting that the case appears to be, shaky at best. They noted some of the same problems I did with the case. And so I would hope that they continue informing their readers of their previous statements, of the loopholes that Bragg is using in this case, which frankly look like just a total desecration of law. But regardless, as did New York Times and Washington Post, which again I mentioned in a previous episode, which I found actually very interesting, to say the least. If I would say interesting, but also in some ways encouraging that you're seeing the what are normally establishment media break ranks to an extent to acknowledge that something is ridiculous. I think that's a good sign. But regardless, let's go further. It says Bragg is seeking to block a subpoena for testimony from Mark Pomerantz, a former senior prosecutor in his office, as well as other demands for confidential documents and testimony from the district attorney himself, as well as his current and former employees and officials. The 50-page suit, the lawsuit against the House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan, is asking a federal court to give emergency and permanent relief that would block enforcement of Jordan's subpoena for Pomerantz to testify on April 20th. Pomerantz told Jordan last month that, per instructions from Bragg's office, he does not plan to cooperate with the subpoena. Now, what's really interesting with this is kind of where Steve Bannon is right now. Steve Bannon, being a former Trump associate who, participated in the book Fire and Fury, which really was an attack against Trump, although I would argue Bannon has since become more on Trump's side yet again. But Bannon, of course, was asked to testify, a few times, but one of them being the January 6th committee hearings. And Bannon refused. And when he refused, they arrested him. Bannon was taken in for contempt of Congress. And given that situation, it's actually very similar to Mark Pomerantz, because Pomerantz was one of the former former prosecutors under DA Alvin Bragg. Pomerantz was the individual who wrote a book about, ironically, an ongoing investigation, the very one that Bragg is bringing out and trying to, again, charge Trump with, and who did media tours. Meaning that Pomerantz has already essentially broken away from the justice system and has become a public figure, an outspoken public figure. And given that situation, I think the House Judiciary Committee would have every right to ask him to testify. Of course, DA Alvin Bragg is pushing back against that, interestingly, by arguing that this is an interference in his investigation. Well, would Pomerantz's publishing of a book based on an ongoing investigation actually urging Bragg to still prosecute Trump when Bragg previously decided not to because, frankly, the case can't stand on its own 2 feet? There are serious questions then which deserve, I think, some kind of higher scrutiny when Bragg's office has demonstrated clear bias on this, onto why they would be investigating or charging criminally the leading political candidate for the Republican Party, if this kind of drama already took place in the office around the specific charges they're trying to bring out from the closet. Now, further into this, NTD notes this. They say the court has rejected Bragg's request for a restraining order against Jim Jordan. Now, keep in mind, this is not the end of it. And I should emphasize that. When you read this, it doesn't mean that the judges tossed out Bragg's attempts to block this legally, generally speaking. This in no way ends that. But it does block part of his request, in particular the restraining order. And it says this: Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg's urgent request to enter a restraining order against Representative Jim Jordan was rejected on April 11th, the same day it was filed. U.S. District Judge Mary Kay Volschel, Vice-Skakul, a Trump appointee, turned down Bragg's emergency request for a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction against Jordan, and said, quote, "The court declines to enter proposed temporary restraining order to show cause, and noted she has not yet received several documents that were referenced in Bragg's filings. She ordered Jim Jordan and other defendants in the case to respond to the lawsuit and scheduled a hearing for April 19th, coming up in about a week." Now, again, of course, you could argue both sides on this. You could argue on one side the federal government should not be intervening in the legal cases at state levels. There is a division between states and federal government, right? We still do have state sovereignty. Part of that ended in this country, interestingly, after the Civil War, because part of the line of Civil War was slavery, of course, was practiced in many states in the South. And they argued that the federal government should not be able to intervene in the rights of states to choose what laws they have and which ones they don't. The federal government argued and eventually won, of course, through a war as well, the Civil War, that, well, there are limits to that. You can't enslave people. And if you want to enslave people, we're going to invade you and take you over and then force you to end that, because that doesn't stand up in this country. It's not what we stand for. But of course, part of the result of that was new additions to the U.S. Constitution, which to an extent did change the way that states, the relationship between state law and federal law. Now, you could argue, interestingly, that part of that is a good thing, because of course it ended slavery on one part, but aside from that, it also made it so the Constitution can be enforced on a state level. Because prior to that, states, to an extent, did not necessarily have to follow the federal constitution. They could have the state constitutions, which could have stipulations that went against it. And so there's mixed sides to it, I should say. The other point with that, though, is that the federal government can have additional powers to interfere with states, and we've seen some of the results of that in particular with, well, frankly, Biden and the way that he has tried to force states to adopt federal laws, and some of the battles we're witnessing right now, for example, between Florida and the federal government, or between Texas and the federal government. Although you could argue Democrats did it too, such as the sanctuary city laws, where they chose not to enforce basic border protections, for example. Now, there are limits to that, of course, right? We're getting into the realm of like real serious nuance. It's not purely black and white. There's a lot of gray area when it comes to this, and a lot of that gray area is not actually clearly defined yet. That gray area is still debatable, and so we're watching a lot of, well, first evers, essentially, in this country. And part of that first ever is going to be, well, what we're witnessing now. What happens if a random district attorney in one state decides to use the law in ways that are not even clearly stated? Meaning, Alvin Bragg is making up laws, essentially. Alvin Bragg is charging someone without even stating what they did wrong. And Alvin Bragg is also charging someone on a misdemeanor that was already past the statute of limitations, meaning Alvin Bragg's case is just full of holes. Even CNN noted it, even New York Times noted it, even Washington Post noted it. It's full of holes. Now, if a rogue DA in any part of America can make up any law they want to bring charges against anyone they want, including a leading political candidate, which will inevitably interfere with America's elections, does the federal government just sit on the sidelines? What do you recommend they do in such a scenario? Would you allow, in this country, a situation where any DA can interfere in the country's elections? Any DA can make up any law they want, and any DA can, frankly, make up things on the spot and target anybody they want. Do you allow that to take place? And so that's the question we're facing now with the House Judiciary Committee. Is it justified for them to investigate this? And that's going to be part of the debate we're going to be watching unfolding over the next, well, several months, probably leading all the way, probably very likely into December, when Trump has his next appearance in court, or the next official one. That being said, some interesting stuff is happening as well. Representative Biggs is introducing bills right now to defund the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, because this is actually something that impacts Bragg as well. Bragg can argue, Alvin Bragg, he can argue, hey, state sovereignty, state rights. But what happens if they're getting federal money? What happens if the violation of federal law, or the gray line he's messing with, the gray area he's messing with, crosses over into federal? Well, that's one of the big issues, because it turns out, as we have now seen, Alvin Bragg used federal government money, meaning this is no longer just a state issue, in the investigation against Donald Trump. And we've seen this issue, for example, with the federal government's intervention in Facebook and social media sites and other things, that once there's a type of federal funding or federal involvement, The federal government can force its own policies to an extent onto the state level or onto the private business level. The school systems, the public schools are a clear example of this, where if they want to keep getting federal government money, they need to follow the federal government's rules. Does that now apply to Alvin Bragg? If the DA's office has been receiving federal government money, does it need to also abide by investigations from the federal level? Does it also have to follow some rules that states might not normally have to follow? While you could argue based on the precedent we've seen in other areas, yes. But let me show you. Representative Alvin Biggs is actually calling for a defunding of this, but by doing this, whether or not it passes, he's bringing attention to the facts I just mentioned. The federal government involvement with this, right? Andy Biggs. It says Representative Andy Biggs has introduced 2 bills to defund the Manhattan District Attorney's Office following the indictment of President Donald Trump. Further, it states, in a comment emailed to the Epoch Times about the bill, Bragg wrote, quote, as the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Crime and Federal Government Surveillance, Biggs wrote this, I will not allow District Attorney Alvin Bragg to misuse federal resources sent by Congress to fund the weaponized prosecution of a former U.S. president while blatantly ignoring soaring crime in New York City. It says that, quote, Bragg has repeatedly, Alvin Bragg, made clear his top priority as district attorney is to leverage the legal system to target conservatives. And he said, I will use every tool I have to protect conservatives and to restore impartiality in our judicial institutions. It notes that Bragg introduced 2 bills on April 13th intended to address these concerns. The first bill, the Accountability for Lawless Violence in Our Neighborhoods Act, or the Alvin Act, cleverly named, would prohibit federal funds from being awarded to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and requires the office to repay federal funds granted after January 1st of 2022. The second bill, the No Federal Funds for Political Prosecutions Act, would prohibit state or local law enforcement agencies from using funds or property seized through asset forfeiture to investigate or prosecute the president, vice president, or a candidate for the office of president in a criminal case. Biggs added that it was concerning to see the Manhattan District Attorney's Office wasting federal resources for political purposes instead of addressing serious crimes in the city. Now, I want to mention something important. A lot of people point to these 2 bills, or to bills in general, and say, it's a bill, it doesn't mean it's written in law, and it's probably going to get shot down by one side or the other within our very divided Congress. And even then, Joe Biden is probably not going to sign it. The founding fathers in the United States made it very, very difficult to change the laws. Unfortunately, you could argue the modern bureaucracies have found a loophole within that where they can use the legislative state and have agencies just create rules that bypass the legislative process in order to do whatever the heck they want. But when it comes to Congress, and even that I should note is legally shaky, but when it comes to Congress, it's very hard for bills to get passed. In particular right now, because the Democrats, Biden is of course in the White House, Biden would have to sign off on any bill to have it written into law. You could argue that Republicans do control the House of Representatives, but Democrats still control the Senate. And even then, you have to get around other different barriers they have in place, such as the filibuster rule, which would make it so that a lot of Democrats would have to get on board, or a lot of Republicans would have to get on board in order for something to be passed. It's very difficult to get anything passed. And so a lot of people see bills and they're like, whatever, ignore it. It's never going to get passed. It doesn't matter. I would argue that it's not quite accurate. One of the big ways this country functions, and any free country functions, is through debate. And part of debate is public information. It is making the public aware of certain issues. And by forcing different politicians to take sides on a certain issue, they're also demonstrating to the public where their politicians actually stand. When it comes to the case against Trump, the case between Alvin Bragg and Donald Trump, the federal government has been trying to stay out of it. The Biden administration is trying to stay out of it. Biden's not, at least trying to not talk about it. And Democrats in general are, I think, trying to kind of ignore it to an extent. I don't think they want this on their hands. Because what Trump keeps saying is that this is political persecution. This is the Democrats attacking him. These are attempts to stop him from running for president. And again, that ties into his entire campaign message, which is that we no longer have a functioning justice system. We need to reform the justice system. And basically, there's so much corruption within the bureaucracies that the deep state needs to be purged. And that's Trump's political platform. The Democrats, if they get involved with this in terms of narrative, it's going to look like they are interfering in the case as well. And it's going to turn this into a national discussion on partisan politics, and in particular, how they're attacking the leading candidate for their opposition. It's in their interest to not get involved, in other words, on many levels. But that's where bills like this come into play. A bill like this is going to force every single member of Congress to take a stand. And it's going to, if it goes all the way to the desk of the President of the United States, it's going to force Joe Biden to take a stand. By doing this, Representative Andy Biggs is forcing them to show their hands. He's forcing them to take the cards they have and put them down on the table and show exactly which cards they've been playing, essentially. And in particular, it's going to force them to rule on whether federal funds should be awarded to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which is one thing, which is going to make the public aware that the Alvin Bragg case is being done using federal money, which does play into Trump's narrative that this is federal involvement in a politicized prosecution. Democrats are going to be forced to say if they agree with that. If they agree with it, it's going to look like this is political persecution from the Democratic Party, and it's going to look very bad on them. I don't think they would want that. They would want to say, no, the federal government has no involvement in the investigation against Trump. That would be in their interest. That's what Biden's been saying. The federal government has no involvement. We want to stay out of this. How dare Trump even suggest we're involved? Well, okay, you're not involved? Well, then vote on this bill that's going to take the money from the federal government out if they want to do stuff like this. And they're going to be like, well, what do? Do you remove the funding and make it look like that you disagree with politicized justice, or do you keep the funding in and make it appear you do agree with it? That is the hand that he is forcing with that. And that is the importance of a bill such as this, even if it doesn't get passed. It's the debate, and it's the public witnessing of the stances of our representatives. And when they have to vote on the No Federal Fund for Political Prosecutions Act, this is going to force them to also state their opinions and show their sides and take their cards and put them down on the table on whether or not they agree that former presidents, vice presidents, and so on should be able to be charged like this, especially or political candidates. And so it's going to force them to take sides. It's going to force them to decide which side of the aisle they stand on, and it's going to show to the public where they stand on this, in the very debate that they do not want to be showing their hands on. And again, that is part of the importance of bills. That is part of the importance of things like this. It's not just about getting it passed. It's about public awareness and the debate. And the debate and the exchange of information and the battle of ideas is a core part of our political system. Now, folks, let's jump over to Epoch TV, but I want to go into a couple big stories, one being how Trump is actually pushing back. Trump is, you could argue, weaponizing justice as well. Trump is suing Michael Cohen, the star witness in all this, for $500 million. And I'll explain why that matters. Also, we're going to go into what the United Nations is doing. The United Nations is right now trying to get additional powers to weaponize emergencies that will give them massive governing abilities, including over the United States, if an emergency is declared. And you could argue that, well, if you want to have those powers, all you got to do is create an emergency. It's going to be big, folks, so join us on Epoch TV for that discussion. We'll jump over now, but let me show a quick trailer before we jump over.
For the past 6 months or so, my team and I have been working on a full-length documentary project. It's called Eat the Bugs, and it exposes a topic that I believe is incredibly important to everyone: the global war on farmers and the, you can say, secret agenda that's behind it, that secret agenda that's pushing it forward. Now, as many of you know, this all started when my team and I traveled to the Netherlands last year in order to cover the protests that were happening there. And after meeting with the local farmers and hearing their stories about how they were going to quite literally lose their generational farms, we were shocked, to say the least. But what we realized soon, as we dug deeper into the story, it became obvious that this was not confined to simply the Netherlands. In fact, this war on farmers, this global war on farmers, was indeed happening everywhere, including right here in the US. And for some odd reason, it coincided with this trend of celebrities promoting edible insects. And so we have been traveling for the better part of the last year on a mission to really understand this global war on farmers, the agenda behind it, what it means for the future of the food in our supermarkets, as well as what the common people like you and me who are caught up in all this can actually do about it. And right now, we're putting together all the interviews and all the findings from our journey into this new awesome documentary called Eat the Bugs. I really cannot wait to share it with you. And if you would like to help back this project, to help us with the funding, to finish editing the thing, and as well as to get it out to as many people across the entire world as possible, well, that would be absolutely awesome. You can go to epicoriginal.com/eatthebugs, or you can just click on that link in the description box below, and there you can sign up for updates, you can share the project with your friends and family, and you can donate some funding so that we can share the powerful voices of all these farmers from across the entire world. Let's make it happen.
Again, folks, that's the documentary Eat the Bugs. If you want to help make that documentary possible, they are doing fundraising for it right now. So, again, check out that website. All right, folks, that says jump over to Epoch TV exclusively. And, folks, on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, join us on Epoch TV. It's our uncensored video platform. And by joining, you'll also help the show keep going. So we do appreciate your support. I'll see you there. And, again, we still have an hour left on the show. So let's continue. And, folks, thank you for being here. Let's talk about what's happening with Trump